Thank you for inviting me to contribute to this important event. The theme is a personal perspective on a role of scholarship in rethinking health professions education. These are exciting times in medical education, and a key factor in the success or failure of the developments is the teacher and the role of the teacher as a scholar. Kelly, in his fundamental text, talked about the teacher as important in the quality of the education experience. In our book, The 8 Roles of the Medical Teacher, we describe 8 roles for the teacher. The roles of the teacher as an information provider who provides the students with information, who facilitates the students' learning, who is responsible for the curriculum development, who also assesses the students' progress, who serves as a role model for the students, and a manager of the learning process, and also the role of the teacher as a scholar and a professional. And in this presentation, I want to look with you in a little bit more depth at the role of the teacher as a scholar and how this can influence change in medical education. I want to talk about the scholarship of teaching from a personal perspective, how I reflected on my teaching, how I looked at evidence-informed decisions and innovations in education, at research into education, at communicating about education, about evaluating education, and finally, what I've described as a civic scholarship, all 7 dimensions of scholarship of teaching. And I want to look with you at each of these in turn. First, looking at the scholar as a reflector on their teaching. We're not just technicians. We're professionals, we're scholars, we reflect on our teaching. This was a point made in TAPS recently by John Norsini. Teaching, he said, is a process of reflection on our practice. And this will result in more scholarly teaching, which in turn will result in higher quality of learning from our students. So reflection is an important attribute of the scholarly teacher. Let me give some examples from a personal perspective of how reflecting led to education change. I first wondered about as a problem the assessment of students. I was responsible as a junior teacher for the final examinations. And I was concerned. It seemed in the clinical examination, some students passed who should fail, and others failed who should pass. It seemed to me we needed an alternative approach to the assessment of clinical competence. And so it left me to think about the development of the OSCE, where students were assessed on performing a number of tasks and assessed by a number of different examiners, the objective structured clinical examination. And I wrote this in a book with Madalena Patricio and Pat Lilly. About the same time in the 1970s, there's a lot of discussion about the curriculum, a lot of discussion about educational strategies. And WHO were sending new deans of new medical schools around the world to look at examples of practice. And they often went to McMaster with its exciting new curriculum. And often happened, they came after visiting McMaster to see our curriculum in Dundee. And I asked them, well, that was a marvelous curriculum in McMaster. Are you going to adopt these strategies in your new school? And the answer usually was no. He said, we couldn't fit them all in. All the strategies wouldn't work in our context. And it let me think, what educational strategies should be adopted? And we need for a model that let people select the strategies that were important. This was the SPICES model. Schools could select which strategies were important and not polarize between two extremes, for or against integration. But on each of the strategies on the SPICES model, which of these they would adopt and where would they be on each of the continua? Another problem that struck me was, what were the competences we expected of a doctor if on graduation they were to meet the needs of the population they were serving? It led me to think of the need for much more consideration of what were the outcomes expected, the importance of outcome-based education. And moving away from concentrating on the process, how many lectures should we give? What sort of assessment should we adopt? So thinking much more of what is the product of the education program? What were the expected outcomes of our final graduate? And this led us to think about in Dundee the three-circle model. In the inner circle were the technical competencies expected of a doctor, the clinical skills, practical procedures, investigations, patient management, health promotion, communication, and information handling. And then in the middle circle, not just doing the right thing, but by doing it right by doing it with an understanding of the science. That's the reason for the anatomy and the physiology and biochemistry. Doing it with the right attitudes and ethics, doing it with the right decision-making, and working as a team. And then in the outer circle, the right person doing it, the doctor equipped to continue with their own personal development after they graduated. A model of outcome-based education. But we also thought about, in terms of the curriculum, a task-based approach to the curriculum, where we identified 104 common tasks the doctor would be faced with after graduation. And we built the curriculum around these 104 tasks. Others have adopted a similar presentation or task-based approach. In Wollongong in Australia, I think there are 98 of these tasks. In Calgary, about 180 of these tasks, all with common tasks, but some similarities. Doing the curriculum around these tasks. Another problem that struck me was concern about the end of course assessment as a big bang end of course assessment. All that mattered was how the students performed on the final written or the final OSCE day. This is my daughter Valerie, who qualified in Dundee in maths and computing, but she wasn't happy with her career there, so she went down to Newcastle and also did a honours degree and got a first class honours in fashion design. And I said to Valerie, compare these two courses, the maths and computing in Dundee and the fashion design in Newcastle. How would you compare the different assessment for your exams? I said, the fashion design was much more difficult. It was much more searching. It was a much greater test of my abilities as a fashion designer, because it wasn't just going in and sitting a single exam. I had to show over a period, build up a portfolio of how I completed a design and delivery of a complete outfit. This let me think of, if portfolios were such an important test in fashion design, could we not adopt the same we expect our students to develop a portfolio of their skills rather than just one single big bang end of course exam? That led us to start using in the final exam in Dundee portfolio assessment, which was collected evidence that they had achieved the expected learning outcomes, all the domains I showed you in the earlier slide. So much about reflecting on teaching. Evidence-informed decisions. We don't make decisions simply based on what I called a fog approach, where decisions in the past were taken on our prejudices as a teacher, our hunches, what might work, our opinion as what might be best, and finally simply guesses as to what would be the most appropriate answer to a particular problem. And move away from such a prejudice-based approach to much more building on evidence. And that left to the development of best evidence medical education, where we moved away from expecting the scholarly teacher to simply base their decisions on opinions, to base their decisions on evidence. And as part of this BME collaboration, a whole set of guides produced. Madhu and Patricia played an important role in developing this BME collaboration. Systematic reviews of what worked in medical education. And this notion of the relationship between best evidence medical education and scholarship was made in an article by Stuart Menon in Medical Teacher, which said these are closely associated, the scholarship of teaching on best evidence medical education. Evidence-informed decisions. And thirdly, the scholarly teacher also innovates in education. Just to give two examples from my personal experience, how even as a lecturer one can innovate. I was concerned that the lectures I was giving in endocrinology were perhaps not the ideal method of communicating to the students what they should know. Perhaps they could learn better with self-learning. And I replaced the lectures with independent learning for a group of the students. And we actually published the results of this experiment in the Lancet, substituting tape-slide programs for the lectures. And what was interesting was that the students who went through this self-learning program improved their position in the class, and they also reacted favorably to the experiment. So one could do away with lectures and replace them with the self-learning materials. Another small experiment I did was to look at multi-professional education. And for our PBL sessions, we combined medical students working with midwife students. And we found that the medical students and the midwives both increased their knowledge about obstetrics, but also they changed their attitudes. They could learn together. Reflection, evidence-informed decisions, innovation, education research. The scholarly teacher is also a researcher in their day-to-day teaching. Coming back to the issue I talked earlier about concern about the assessment of students' clinical competence, it wasn't fair. But what was the evidence that we should change to an OSCE? What was wrong with the previous traditional clinical assessment? Well, we did a study and published it again in the Lancet that examined how effective, how reliable, how accurate were clinical examiners. This was one of the tables results we showed. You can see in the horizontal axis 9 students, and each of the yellow dots is an examiner with 14 examiners marked the same examination. It was videotaped and marked the same examination. You can see the huge range. And the second student, 29, one examiner almost failed the students, whereas 4 examiners gave them a high mark. Huge range of marks for the same examination. Not a very satisfactory traditional examination. One of the moves to change to an OSCE. So as teachers, we should not just be consumers of research, But as teachers, we should be producers of research. We should not just be someone who's researched upon. We as scholarly teachers should be researchers. So, researcher as a scholarly teacher. And fifthly, we need to communicate about our education experience as a scholarly teacher. We need to communicate, and we can do this through journals, publishing papers in journals, or through communicating at conferences, at meetings such as this meeting, communicating our experience, what we found works and what doesn't work in one of the many journals, for example, Medical Teacher, or one of the other journals in medical education. It was Schulman who said about communication, we develop a scholarship of teaching when our work as teachers becomes public. Our work's got to become public, peer-reviewed and critiqued and exchanged with members of our professional communities, so they can build on our work, so others can build on our work as teachers. An important feature of scholarship. And not just about our research, about the curriculum. In our book, Essential Skills for a Medical Teacher, we described 10 questions that should be asked about a curriculum. And question 8 of the 10 questions was, how should details of the curriculum be communicated? How should details of the curriculum be communicated? Part of the role of a scholarly teacher. And as scholarly teachers, we should also be concerned with evaluation of education, evaluation of the curriculum. We should be evaluating the curriculum, but we should also be evaluating our own teachers. As scholars, we should be inquirers into our own competence. As scholarly teachers, inquirers into our own competence. Evaluation of education. And Hammersley said this about the teachers and evaluator of their own teaching. The teacher is or ought to be a skilled practitioner, of course, but they should be continually reflecting on his or her practice in terms of ideals and knowledge of local situations, and modifying practice in light of these reflections. Rather than simply being a technician, merely applying scientifically produced curriculum programs. So we're not just a technician, as I said before, we're a scholar, and we should be evaluating our teaching, inquirers into our own competence. Reflection, evidence-informed decisions, innovations, education research, communication, evaluation of education. And finally, a civic scholarship. Civic scholarship, by this I mean it's a broader vision of scholarship of teaching. It's one where endeavours aimed at improving learning and creating a better world within which to learn and teach are nested within the larger concern for creating a better world. So we're concerned in our teaching about creating a better world. For example, here's just 3 examples, very much on today's agenda, about sustainability and climate change. We should be concerned about that as a scholarly teacher, about global health care, about gun violence. So I've given a personal perspective of how thinking about scholarship could bring about change. I've discussed the role of the scholarly teacher as someone who reflects on their teaching, which can result in change, how they can make evidence-informed decisions, how they can innovate in education, how they can do research in their own education, how they can communicate about it through publishing, how they can evaluate their education. And finally, I've described this idea of civic scholarship. Reflection that can lead to education change. But in this last part of my presentation, I want to suggest that for me, it's not just stopped. The many areas I want to continue reflecting on, which I may not be able to change, but at least I can think about and ask others to think about, continuing reflection. I think there's still a number of challenges. This may be the more provocative part of my presentation. One challenge, I think, is the notion of a national licensing examination. It's been widely adopted for very good reasons. I can understand that logic behind introducing a national licensing examination. But I also think with it is serious problems. It might change the students' learning and the curriculum. This is an example of the problems as described at a meeting of AME and the Ottawa Conference in Lyon, where one of the participants described how the national examination being introduced in their country had an impact and destroyed all the other work they were doing on developing a more programmatic force of assessment.
Some colleagues of mine in Thailand from another medical school, they have tried to implement programmatic assessment in their curriculum, and they have done away with all the high stake tests, and they have implemented a lot of low stake tests over like a lot of data points over time. And then there was this resistance from both the faculty and the students, particularly on the fear that they did not believe that all these low stake tests combined together would help the students pass the high stake test, the looming high stake test, which was the national licensing examination. And so there was a huge resistance there. And that's when they had to kind of move.
So the national examination being introduced destroyed all the work they were doing with other forms of assessment, developing a more programmatic approach to assessment. Another challenge I worry about is that with COVID, there's been a move away from face-to-face performance assessment. And I think that's wrong. As we introduced in the OSCE, I think to assess a student's clinical ability, I think you've got to look at them face-to-face. In, for example, an OSCE, work-based assessment may not be adequate. This is a point made by John Nocini, again at the same consensus conference in Lyon as part of the Ottawa Conference. The problem with work-based assessment, doing away with face-to-face assessment.
I'm a little troubled by the loss of those high-stakes performance-based examinations. I do not think that workplace-based assessment, much as I love it, is a substitute for that in its current iteration. I would like to think that someday it might be, but I don't see that happening. Certainly not in my limited lifetime at this point.
So some concern about the trends in performance assessment. Another challenge I worry about is still the widespread use of MCQs, because there's good evidence now that very short answer questions are both more reliable and more valid. Yet people continue using MCQs. It's now practically possible to mark with the computer very short answer questions. This was a paper in BMC, Medical Education. Very short answer questions are a viable alternative to multiple choice questions. But why people don't use them? Another concern I reflect on, is the issue of selecting. We've tended to select students with the highest academic qualifications, better methods of selecting the cream of the cream, the better students academically. Whereas what we should be doing in a selection of our students for admission to medicine is trying to identify the students who would not be good doctors, who should not be admitted because they will not become good doctors. And this was a point made with describing the techniques of doing this by David Powis and his group in this article in Medical Teacher, a comprehensive model for selection of medical students, How do we avoid admitting to medicine students who should not be there to study? And finally, the issue of graduate entry. Increasingly, many schools, rather than taking students straight from secondary school, want them to have a graduate degree before they enter medicine. Again, I can understand some of the thinking, wanting more mature students entering medical studies. But again, there's no evidence whatsoever that this results in a better product, and it's also more expensive. So I think there's no real evidence in favor of graduate entry, as distinct from direct entry from school. And finally, I think it's a challenge that always worries me about the length of the training program. Do we really need 13 years to train a specialist? And I think the ways of shortening that program. In the House of Lords in the UK, indeed, it was suggested that medical training has to change and training may need to be shorter. Training may need to be shorter. And I think there are ways of achieving this. So I think there are a number of areas where I still have a concern about medical education, concern about the dominance of a national licensing exam and the adverse effects, concern about performance assessment becoming more online rather than face-to-face, concern that perhaps we should be thinking more about very short answer questions on MCQs, concerns about what we're trying to do in selection, not to get the cream of the cream, but perhaps identifying students who should not be admitted, concern about the move to graduate entry, and concern about the need to try and find ways of leading to a shorter training program. Many of these are difficult questions. Many are about assessment, and the next Ottawa conference, I showed excerpts from the last Ottawa conference in Lyon, the next Ottawa conference in February in Melbourne is going to be looking at many of these issues, and I hope maybe to see some of the answers to these problems I've raised. So in conclusion, I think as teachers, our role is important, and scholarship of teaching should be highlighted. We should be reflecting, as scholarly teachers, reflecting on our teaching. We should be using evidence-informed decisions, best evidence medical education. We should be innovating in our teaching. We should be undertaking research in our day-to-day teaching practice. We should be communicating to others through conferences and journals about communication. And we should be evaluating the education process and our own teaching inquires into our own competence. And finally, we should think about this notion of civic scholarship, dealing with issues such as sustainability. So as I started, these are exciting times in medical education. Whether what was being introduced is successful or fails, to a large extent depends on our role as a teacher, our role as a teacher scholar. We are key players at this important time in medical education, adopting these 7 different approaches as scholars. And I wanted to close with this quote from Boye, who first described this notion of scholarship. Boye said, "Scholarship is not the prerogative of a small elite bands of teachers who are education specialists and who have committed most of their time to teaching. Scholarship is not an esoteric appendix. Scholarship is at the very heart of teaching. So scholarship is not just for others, for this small elite group of researchers or whatever. Scholarship is for all of us. It's at the very heart of our teaching." So thank you, and I'd be pleased to have your comments, your views on what I've suggested, and to answer any questions. Again, I'm sorry that I'm not with you in person for this important meeting, but thank you again for the invitation to share some of my thoughts with you. Thank you.